الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ولا ضد له ولا مثيل له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله بلغ الرسالة وأدى الأمانة. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Isra or Surah Bani Israel, which is chapter 17, verses 4 and 5, after أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وقضينا إلى بني إسرائيل في الكتاب لتفسدن في الأرض مرتين ولتعلن علوا كبيرا فإذا جاء وعد أولاهما بعثنا عليكم عبادا لنا أولي بأس شديد فجاسوا خلال الديار وكان وعدا مفعولا. And we decreed for the children of Israel in the book, and we said the book is the Torah, that twice would you do mischief on earth and be elated with mighty arrogance, and twice would you be punished. When the first of warning come to pass, we sent against you our servants, given to terrible warfare. They entered the very inmost part of your homes, and it was a warning completely fulfilled. So last time I started talking about the prophecy that's mentioned in Surah Al-Isra or Surah Bani Israel regarding the rise and fall of Bani Israel twice in the history of mankind. As we know of, I mentioned one and we're still talking about it. But last time I made one, before I forget, I made one simple mistake. I would like to correct it. When I mentioned about after the death of Sulaiman alayhi salam, there was mutiny again among the Israelites. And during the life of Sulaiman alayhi salam, that's when the state of Israel was at its peak. One of the Israelites, his name is Yarba'an ibn Nabat, was trying to cause mutinies and mischiefs around Bani Israel. So Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam kicked him out to Egypt. But after the death of Sulaiman alayhi salam, this guy Yarba'an came back. And I said that 11 of the tribes formed the northern state. It's not 11, it's 10 of the tribes. The other two were under the son of Sulaiman alayhi salam. His name is Rahba'an, the son of one of the sons of Sulaiman alayhi salam, and he formed with the tribe of Yehuda and Benjamin the southern kingdom of Israel, and that's where the first temple was, in the southern temple, because Jerusalem was in the southern kingdom and the temple was there. So in these two verses I mentioned last time also regarding that Allah will, after they do their first tries and cause mischievousness and corruption and tyranny, and that happened after the death of Sulaiman alayhi salam, that Allah will send servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I mentioned that when Allah mentions servant, not necessarily means believers. As a matter of fact, during the time of Al-Khalifa Amir al-Mu'mineen, Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, when he sent Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas to fight the Persians, he gave him a long speech to him and the soldiers. But part of the speech, he reminded them that do not think the way the Israelites thought back in those days when they had their state, that Allah will never have their enemies win over them because they are believers and their enemies are not believers. And he goes and mentions that Khalifa Umar, that Allah sent kuffar to destroy the state of Bani Israel, and we mentioned that state was the first Islam, obviously, because there was no other religion. So that was the Islam of that time. So he reminded them to do not make the same mistake, that Allah will make us win when we are good. But if we are equal in sins with our enemies, the one who has more in numbers and more in weapons and more organized is the one who's going to win, even if they are kuffar or not believers. So as we know, Khalifa Umar was a scholar. So why would he say kuffar if Allah means ibadan lana means believer? So obviously he knows what Allah meant is not necessarily meaning the ibadan lana or our servant, meaning believers. The ibadan lana could be, or our servant could be, non-believers. Also, I want to remind you of the authentic hadith of Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam regarding when you make religious trips. Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam emphasized it happens only through 3 cities. And that's in Mecca, where the prayers is equivalent to 100,000 prayers, or in Medina, where that's the second city, where the prayers is equivalent to 1,000, and Jerusalem, where the prayer is equivalent to 500 prayers. So the importance of the Jerusalem in this is mentioned also in the hadith. And we mentioned last time that Palestine is mentioned in the Quran 5 times as a blessed land and 1 time as a holy land. And as a reminder also that the journey of Al-Isra, which took place in 621 AD, only 1 ayah is mentioned in the surah of Al-Isra, but the rest is the story of the Israelites. But there is a relationship. Allah is trying to tell us that there will be incidents in that holy land, in that blessed land, related to the trip of Al-Isra and the religious importance of it to all Muslims. So in verse 5, when Allah says that your enemies will come, فَجَاسُوا خِلَالَ الدِّيَارِ, when you cause tyranny, when you cause mischievousness in the land, that such corruption of the society of the people of Israel will come as a result of elation and criminality, as a result of tyranny, as a result of transgression that they did among themselves. Now, when we read the history books, we'll find out that during that time, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians kept going back and forth, attacking them and putting onto the Israelites, whether the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, puppet kings. And each kingdom had 19 kings, and each one of them were a puppet king, whether to the Egyptians or to the Assyrians or to the Babylonians. The scholars explain to us that the word Jasu has 2 meanings. Jasu over here means going back and forth, and for 313 years, one of the meaning of it is the enemies kept going back and forth fighting them because they were corrupt. And the second meaning is they entered the innermost cities. So when the Assyrians destroyed the northern states, they literally entered every street, every home, and made sure there is no Jews stay alive or no Jews stay in that area. They took them all to be slaves in Iraq. The same thing 100 years or 135 years later, when the Babylonians attacked the southern kingdom, they did the same thing. They entered the innermost. فَجَاسُوا خِلَالَ الدِّيَارِ. They entered the innermost, going to the same street, to the same alley, more than 1 time, going back and forth to make sure no one stays in there. And they took them all out and destroyed their first temple, the temple that was built by Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam. So Allah mentions here that we sent against you our servants that will destroy that state and completely obliterate it. And that's exactly what happened. When you read the history books, that's what you will find. And they admit to that. That's what happened. And they were taken all as slaves, whether the first kingdom or the second kingdom, as slaves to Iraq. That's where Babylonia and Assyria were there. I just want to remind you, who are the descendants of the Egyptians of back then, of the Assyrians back then, and of the Babylonians of back then? The Arabs. So who the first ones that destroyed the first state of Israel in 586 BC? Technically, they are the Arabs. But they were not believers back then. Then after that came, so that's the word, the meaning of it, whether our predecessors or contemporary scholars, how they explain fajasu. Fajasu means the fa in the jasu is the continuation of going back and forth to make sure that there is no one left among the Bani Israel behind. So after that, the Greeks came, and we mentioned last time the Greeks are the ones that the first ones to give the official name of Palestine or Palestine to the land of Canaan, in honor of the Philistines that came from Crete, and the name stayed, and the Romans made it officials. But they tried, the Israelites, back when the Romans allowed them to do their religious freedom in Israel. They gave them religious autonomy over Jerusalem only, and the rights or the kingdom was belonging to the Romans. And they tried to rebel against the Romans in 70 AD. So the Romans quelled the rebellion and did not completely destroy their second temple, because that's when they built their second temple. But in 135 AD, that's when the Romans completely obliterated the second temple of Bani Israel and kicked every Jewish out. But remember, they were not a power back then. They were just living under the Roman Empire, and kicked them out. And that's when they went to Medina. You have the Jews that lived in Medina during Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, or went back to Babylonia or Europe and all over the world. If you read any history book before 1948, you will never find a mention of the state of Israel except that time, 1000 BC, which was completely destroyed by the Arabs in 586 BC. There is no mention of it in the entire history. That's the only rise that they had. The second rise came in verse 6 in Surah Al-Isra, chapter 17, when Allah mentions ثم رددنا لكم الكرة عليهم وأمددناكم بأموال وبنين وجعلناكم أكثر نفيرا. And after a time we allowed you to prevail against them, and remember the word them, once again, and aided you with wealth and offspring, and made you more numerous than ever. So in this verse, in chapter 17, or Surah Bani Israel, or Surah Al-Isra, then we did grant you the return as against them. Who's them? The one who destroyed you the first time. Who destroyed you the first time? Who destroyed Bani Israel the first time? The Arabs. So this indicates that the Bani Israel will regain power over who destroyed their first independent state, who are the Arabs, and they did regain power over them. This has not happened in history except in 1948. And then Allah mentioned, we consider that the Bani Israel regained power over those who destroyed their first state, their first independent state, which is the state that was built by Dawood alayhi salam in 1000 BC. The ones who moved back and forth through the land in the aftermath of the first mischief were the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who are the Arabs of today. There are their descendants. But total destruction was at the hands of the Assyrians and the Babylonians of the first king, the first state, as we mentioned before. So by looking into history of Bani Israel, of the sons of Israel, both past and present, one can conclude that the return of power indeed taken place only for real in 1948. You will never find in history book written before 1948 there was a mention of the state of Israel ever, except that time. And that the people over whom Bani Israel regained power are the present day Arabs. And that's exactly what happened in 1948, whose ancestors are the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And they are the ones, as we mentioned before, were responsible for the destruction of the first state of Israel. Now there are things to notice in this ayah. There are 6 things to notice, and this is happened in reality. And this verse of verse 6 that I just read, when Allah mentioned that we made you regain power over them, over the Arabs. First, the Bani Israel building a powerful state that dominates over those responsible for the destruction of their first state, of their first kingdom. And those are the Arabs. And that second state never existed in the history since that first state happened. The second thing in this ayah mentions that the Bani Israel receives a huge and continuous financial help from, whether, as we know, from the United States and other Western power, and we're talking in the billions, and if it wasn't for that financial help, they will cease to exist. The third thing that this ayah mentions, that the Bani Israel will receive a huge number of immigrants who are what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mention amwal wa banin. Banin is the offspring. And the Jewish social network that helped the immigrants come to the occupied Palestine were always from 1948 emphasizing that they want the immigrants to be youth more important. Why? Because the youth are the ones who's gonna build the future state that it's gonna be about to be formed. And that's exactly what happened from 1948 forward up until the 80s, that the majority of the immigrants were youth, whether men or women, and the majority were men. The fourth thing this ayah talking about, when Allah mentioned that we made you regain power over them, over the Arabs, that the last part of the ayah was أكثر نفيرا. أكثر نفيرا, when you read the translation of it, they translate it as more in numbers. As we know, you will never have the Bani Israel more than the Arabs, even 1948. So as a nation we're talking about. The Arabs were always more than Bani Israel. But what happened in 1948, that the 6 or 7 Arab countries, they only gave 20,000 soldiers with only light weapons. So that was the army of the Arabs to fight against Bani Israel to take back Palestine from them. But the Israelites at that time, they were 67,000. Even though the nation as a nation were a lot, but the number of the soldiers or the army were bigger in size, and that's the meaning of Akthar and Afira, more numerous in the size of the army and more numerous in the equipment of the army. And that still exists until today. It's still true until today. That even though the number of Arabs as a nation is more, but the army is more equipped. The Bani Israel is more equipped and has more money and more well trained. The fifth thing is mentioned in verse 104 of Surah Al-Isra. So the second rise is what's interesting. The first rise is mentioned one time. The second rise it's actually the word is al-akhirah, and the ayah I said is al-akhirah, means it's the last rise. But a lot of the translation mention it as a second rise. So the last rise is mentioned twice in verse 7 and verse 6, and in verse 104. In verse 104, Allah says, وَقُلْنَا مِنْ بَعْدِهِ لِبَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ اسْكُنُوا الْأَرْضَ فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ جِئْنَا بِكُمْ لَفِيفًا. That Allah says, and we said thereafter to the children of Israel, dwell securely in the land of promise, but when the last rise or the second rise come to pass, we gathered you together in mingled crowd. And that's exactly the events that took place in the land of Palestine or occupied Palestine, as Allah mentions that they will be more in numbers. And the last thing noticed about this two rises in the two ayats, which is verse 6 and 104 in Surah Al-Isra, when Allah mentions that He will bring back the Israelites Lafifa, The word Lafifa, mingled crowd. When you look at Google maps to look over a certain trail or over certain areas, like Bear Mountain, for example, and it looks to you like very heavy in trees, and the trees all look like as if they are in one route. But when you go there, when you go to that trail, when you go to Bear Mountain, you will find that each tree has its own trunk and its own root. Now, the first state of Israel was one ethnicity. And it was the true Bani Israel, each one of them from the 12 tribes. The second Bani Israel, technically they are not Bani Israel, because 90% of them, maybe more, but I'll be modest and say 90%, are converts. Only 10% actually Bani Israel. But when Allah mentions Akthar al-Lafifa, the only time in history when Bani Israel gathered in one spot on earth, when they are Akthar Lafifa, meaning from mingled crowd, they are from 70 nationalities and 90 ethnicities. Never ever happened in the history of mankind that they existed in one land except in the land of occupied Palestine after 1948. And that's mentioned in verse 104. And it's happened and it came to reality. And that's what we're living today. So these are the 6 things that the 6 notices about the second rise or the last rise of Bani Israel. Then Allah comes and says in the same surah, Surah Al-Isra, verse 7, إن أحسنتم أحسنتم لأنفسكم وإن أسأتم فلها فإذا جاء وعد الآخرة ليسوءوا وجوهكم وليدخلوا المسجد كما دخلوه أول مرة وليتبروا ما علوا تتبيرا. I'm thinking we are not going to have time to finish it, but I'll start with it. If you do good to yourselves or to your souls, you are doing it to yourselves. And if you do bad, you are doing bad to yourselves. When the last rise happened, Allah is mentioned, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ. The translation of وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ, the last rise, comes لِيَسُوءُ وُجُوهَكُمْ, to disfigure your faces. And we'll come to the explanation of that. Who is going to disfigure their faces? The ones who disfigured their faces the first time. Who were they? The Arabs. The ones they defeated in 1948. Now, I want to make sure you understand that I do not mean the current day Arabs will disfigure their faces. The current day Arab governments are the protectors of the sons of Israel or the sons of Zion. Okay, they are not the ones. So there will be maybe sometime, I don't know if I'm going to be alive or we're going to be alive to see this, there will be another Arab Spring. But it will be a true one where it's more organized and more of just and more united, that will take all these protectors of the sons of Bani Israel from the Arab rulers and will be more united. So these are the ones who will do it, not today's Arabs. Today's Arabs will not do it. Okay? So I don't know if we will live to see it, but we know this is going to happen before the end of time. And we cannot put a time stamp on it. We don't know. That's something in the ghaib or something in the future. So, لِيَسُوءُ وُجُوهَكُمْ, to disfigure your faces, and they will enter the mosque. What mosque are we talking about? We're still in the same place, Jerusalem. So they will enter the mosque the way they entered it the first time. And how did they enter it the first time? Back in 586 BC, that's the first time they entered it and destroyed everything. And that's when Allah says, وَلِيَتَبِّرُوا مَا عَلَوْا تَتْبِيرًا, that they will completely destroy. And Allah is explaining in this ayah, and I will not have time to go into the details of it. Inshallah, we'll finish it next time. But Allah is explaining when that future battle will take place, it will be a very violent battle. Allah is mentioning in the ayah. And that's the meaning of وَلِيُتَبِّرُوا مَا عَلَوْا تَتْبِيرًا. And inshallah, we'll continue with it next time, and we'll explain it and end it next time. I would like to remind myself first and foremost, and you, with the hadith of Rasul alayhi salatu wassalam, when he mentions to say Subhanallah wa bihamdih, Subhanallah al-Azim at least 100 times a day. It's very heavy in the scale of good deeds and very light on the tongue and very beloved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. Ask Allah for forgiveness. He is the most forgiving, the most merciful.